last light of the afternoon settled over the pastry case like something warm and unhurried, turning the glazed tops of the remaining croissants the color of late autumn. The shop was nearly empty. A few customers lingered over their cups near the back, and the hum of the espresso machine had slowed to a low, occasional groan. That was when the little girl walked in. She couldn't have been more than 8. She approached the counter slowly, looked up at the woman behind the register, and asked, in a voice so quiet it nearly disappeared beneath the music, "Do you have any leftover pastries? Ones you were going to throw away? I want to bring something home for my dad." She believed, the way only children can believe, that sweetness had the power to reach a person who had gone somewhere unreachable, that even a small, imperfect thing could pull someone back, if only for a moment. The woman behind the counter began to shake her head. She never finished. At a corner table by the window, a woman in a charcoal blazer looked up from her papers. She had heard every word. For a moment, she simply watched. The child, the counter, the last light on the glass, and then her gaze drifted outside to the man standing on the sidewalk, waiting. The way he stood told her everything, and in that moment, without yet knowing why, she understood that she had just walked to the edge of something that would change the direction of her life, not only theirs, but her own. If stories like this stay with you, stories about ordinary people doing quiet, extraordinary things, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. His name was Calvin Brooks, and for 11 years he had never been late. Not once. Not during the winter the city froze over and half the transit lines went down. Not during the 3 months after his wife Renee was diagnosed, when he was running on 4 hours of sleep and cold coffee and the determination of a man who has decided that falling apart is not an option. He showed up. He clocked in. He did the work. It was the one thing in his life he could control, and he had held on to it the way a person holds on to the one wall still standing after a storm. Calvin worked in logistics operations at Hartwell Distribution, a mid-sized company handling freight coordination for a network of regional retailers. His title was Operations Coordinator, Level 2, which meant in practice that he was the person the warehouse floor called when something broke down, when a shipment arrived wrong, when the systems disagreed with reality. He was not the kind of employee who appeared in quarterly reports or got mentioned in company-wide emails. He was the kind who made it possible for those reports to say what they said. His colleagues liked him, not the performative kind of liking that makes a workplace bearable. The real kind. The kind where people remember what you take in your coffee and save you a seat without being asked. He was steady, dependable. The sort of man who fixed problems quietly and didn't require acknowledgement for it. He was also raising his daughter alone. Sophie was 8 years old, small for her age, with her mother's eyes and her father's habit of watching people carefully before deciding what to say. Renee had been gone for 3 years now, a cardiac condition that moved faster than anyone had expected, faster than any of them were ready for. Calvin had sat Sophie down the night after the funeral and told her, as plainly as he could, that things were going to be different now, but they were not going to be broken. He believed that when he said it. He kept believing it, through the rent increases and the school pickups and the evenings when the apartment was too quiet. Sophie knew her father was strong. She had always known that. But lately something had shifted in him, something she couldn't name but could feel the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. He had stopped humming in the kitchen. He sat at the table after dinner with his hands around a cold mug and his eyes somewhere far away. He smiled when she spoke to him, but it came a half-second late, like a translation. It had started 2 weeks ago. Calvin had been in the middle of a shift when his phone buzzed. Sophie's school, a number he had memorized and hoped never to see on his screen during work hours. The school nurse spoke carefully, the way people speak when they want to be precise without causing panic. Sophie had fallen on the blacktop during recess, possible mild concussion. They needed a parent to come in. He went immediately to his supervisor, a man named Vince Garrett, who managed the floor with the brand of authority that mistakes inflexibility for competence. Calvin explained the situation. Vince told him it was peak processing hours and denied the request. Calvin left anyway. When he returned the following morning, there was a formal incident report waiting on his desk, filed under unauthorized absence without approved leave. He read it twice. Every word was technically accurate. Every word was also a lie. Over the next 10 days, the report moved through channels Calvin had no access to. Annotated, summarized, reframed. By the time it reached human resources, it no longer contained a daughter or a phone call or a nurse's careful voice. It contained only a rule and a man who had broken it. Calvin was terminated on a Thursday. He drove home in silence, walked into the apartment, and sat down in the chair by the window. He was still sitting there when Sophie got home from school. Sophie noticed everything. She noticed that her father no longer set his work bag by the door when he came home. She noticed that the alarm on his phone, the one that went off at 5:47 every morning, had stopped. She noticed that he ate less, spoke less, and that the chair by the window had become the place where he disappeared to, the way some people disappear into sleep or silence, or a room with a closed door. She didn't ask. She was 8, but she understood, in the wordless way children understand things that haven't been explained to them, that there are kinds of sadness that questions make worse. What she remembered instead was a Tuesday, almost a year ago, when she had come home with a failed spelling test folded into the bottom of her backpack. She had tried to hide it. Her father had found it anyway, not because he was looking, but because he always seemed to know. He hadn't scolded her. He had gone to the cabinet above the refrigerator and come back with a small white paper bag from the bakery 2 blocks over, the one he stopped at every morning on his way to work. Inside were 2 shortbread cookies dusted with powdered sugar. "Eat one," he had said, settling into the chair beside her. "Sweets don't fix problems, but they remind you that the world still has good things in it. You solve the problem, and you let the good thing be good." She had eaten both cookies. He hadn't said anything about that. She thought about that afternoon now, looking at her father sitting at the window in the pale November light, his hands around a mug that had gone cold an hour ago. She thought about the way his face had looked on that Tuesday, patient and present and entirely hers, and about how different it looked now. She made a decision the way children make decisions, quickly, quietly, and with complete conviction. She went to her room and opened the small tin box on her desk where she kept the coins she'd collected from birthdays and good report cards and the occasional dollar her father slipped her for helping carry groceries. She counted it out on her bedspread. It wasn't much. It might not be enough for a full-priced anything. But she knew that bakeries threw things away at the end of the day. Her father had told her that once, passing one on a Sunday evening. "They can't sell yesterday's bread," he had said. "Shame, really." Sophie put the coins in her jacket pocket, told her father she was going outside for a few minutes, and walked the 2 blocks to the small bakery beneath the gray office tower on Clement Street, the one he used to stop at every morning before work, the name Hartwell Distribution printed on the badge that was still clipped to the canvas bag hanging by the front door. She pushed open the door and walked up to the counter. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you have any leftover pastries? Ones you were going to throw away? I want to bring something home for my dad." Diana Mercer had not intended to stay this long. She had walked into the bakery at 5:20 with the specific purpose of sitting for 30 minutes, finishing her notes from the afternoon's board review, and leaving before the evening traffic made the drive home something she would regret. The table by the window was her usual spot when she came here, which was most weekdays because the bakery sat exactly 1 block from the glass tower that housed the executive offices of Mercer Group Holdings, the company her father had founded and that she had run for the past 9 years. Close enough to walk, far enough, she had always told herself, to think clearly. She had not been thinking clearly today. The board review had surfaced 3 underperforming subsidiaries, a pending compliance question in the southwestern region, and a compensation restructuring proposal that she suspected 2 of her senior directors had agreed on before the meeting even started. She had said little and absorbed everything, which was her way. She would decide later, alone, when the noise of the room was gone. She was underlining a figure in the margin of her notes when she heard the child's voice. It was the quietness of it that made her look up. Not timid, there was a difference. But careful, the way someone speaks when they are not sure they have the right to ask, but have decided to ask anyway. Diana watched the girl at the counter, watched the employee's expression shift toward apology. And then, without fully deciding to, she closed her notebook and stood. She crossed the bakery in a few steps, touched the counter lightly, and told the employee she would take care of it. The employee looked relieved. Diana turned to the girl. "What kind is your dad like?" Sophie looked up at her, wary for just a moment, the wariness of a child who has been taught to be careful with strangers, and then said, "He likes the ones with powdered sugar, or anything that's not too sweet." Diana ordered a small box. While they waited, she asked, simply and without pressure, why Sophie wanted to bring her father something from the bakery. Sophie told her, not all at once and not in order, but in the way children tell things, in pieces, looping back, filling in the edges as she remembered them. Her dad had lost his job. He had left work to come get her when she got hurt at school, and then they said he wasn't allowed to do that and let him go. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just being her dad. Diana listened. She asked one or two careful questions, not interrogating, only following. The name of the company, the department, the rough shape of what had happened. And then Sophie mentioned the badge. "It says Hartwell Distribution on his work badge," she said. "He has it on his bag at home. He never took it off." Diana's pen stopped moving. Hartwell was a subsidiary, third tier, freight coordination, acquired 4 years ago as part of a regional expansion. It sat inside the operational arm of Mercer Group Holdings. It sat, in other words, inside her company. She looked toward the window. On the sidewalk outside, a man stood waiting in the early dark, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly forward, eyes on the pavement. He was not pacing. He was not checking his phone. He was simply standing in the stillness of someone who has stopped expecting things to improve. Diana had seen a great many things in 9 years of running a company. She had made hard decisions and necessary ones, and several she still turned over in her mind late at night. But she had never had to ask herself this specific question before. How much of this, she thought, happened inside something I built? She didn't do anything dramatic that night. Diana went home, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at the desk in her study with her laptop open and the city quiet outside. She pulled up the internal HR portal, the executive access she rarely used for anything below director level, and searched the name Calvin Brooks. The file was there. Neatly organized, properly time-stamped, each field completed with the careful language of someone who understood that documentation is only as useful as it is defensible. She read the incident report. She read the termination notice. She read the supervisor's summary, filed by a man named Vince Garrett. Nowhere in any of it was there a school nurse. Nowhere was there a daughter, a phone call, a child who had fallen on a blacktop and needed her father. What existed on paper was clean and uncomplicated. An employee who had left his post without authorization during peak operational hours in violation of Section 4.2 of the Workplace Conduct Policy. Every word was accurate. The file was also, in any honest reading of it, incomplete in a way that was not accidental. Diana called the head of HR at Hartwell the next morning, a woman named Patricia Cole, who had been in the role for 6 years, and who answered in the measured tone of someone who had learned to be careful around calls from the top floor. Diana asked about the Brooks case. Patricia said it had been handled correctly. Diana asked whether the circumstances leading to the absence had been documented anywhere. Patricia said the employee had not provided formal documentation at the time of the incident. Diana asked whether he had been given the opportunity to do so before termination proceedings began. There was a pause. Brief, but present, and then Patricia said the timeline had followed standard protocol. Diana thanked her and ended the call. Standard protocol. It was the kind of phrase that answered a question by replacing it with a different one. It did not say, yes, he was given a fair chance. It said, we followed the steps, and the steps are not something you can argue with. It was the sound a system made when it was explaining why it didn't need to examine itself. She left a message for Calvin through an intermediary, a junior HR coordinator she trusted to be discreet, asking if he would be willing to speak with her directly. She did not explain who she was or why. He didn't respond. She found out later, through the coordinator, that he had received the message, read it, and said nothing. That he had looked at it for a moment and then set his phone down. She understood why. Calvin Brooks had spent 11 years doing everything right inside a system that had, in the end, treated him as a variable to be removed. A call from someone at the top of that same system, offering no explanation, asking for a conversation, would have looked like exactly one of two things: an attempt to manage the situation quietly, or a trap. Neither was a reason to respond. Diana did not take it personally, but she also did not stop. She requested the full HR audit trail for the Hartwell Operations Division, not just Calvin's file, but the last 18 months of disciplinary actions, leave requests, and supervisor reports. She told her assistant to mark the request as routine operational review. She did not tell anyone else what she was looking for. What she had was a feeling, the feeling of a person who runs a large organization and has just realized that running it well at the top does not tell you very much about what is happening at the bottom. She had learned things in 9 years of leadership. She was beginning to suspect she had not learned enough. She found him on a Wednesday morning just after 7. The address had come from the HR audit trail, not his home, but a secondary contact record, a temporary work placement filed under a job assistance program Hartwell had nominally offered departing employees. A warehouse near the Port District, small freight operation, cash-in-hand loading work for men who needed income while they figured out what came next. Diana drove herself. She parked across the street from the warehouse entrance and waited. At 7:14, the loading bay doors rolled open and workers began to file out. She recognized Calvin from the way Sophie had described him without describing him. Just my dad, the way children name the most important person in their world, as though no further detail could possibly be necessary. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberateness of someone whose body was tired, but who had decided not to show it. He carried his jacket over one arm. He was looking at the ground. She got out of the car and crossed the street. He saw her before she reached him. He stopped walking, looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of flat recognition, as though he had been expecting something like this and had not decided yet what to do with it. "Mr. Brooks," she said, "my name is Diana Mercer. I'm the CEO of Mercer Group Holdings. Hartwell Distribution is part of my company." He said nothing. "I'd like to talk with you if you're willing. I've read your file. I don't think it tells the full story." Calvin looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You came here to tell me something I've known for 2 weeks?" It was not said with bitterness. It was said the way people say things when they are too tired for anything other than the truth. And Diana recognized it immediately as the absence of performance. He was not posturing. He was just done. "Yes," she said. "I know that's not enough. I'm not here to offer you enough. I'm here because I want to understand what actually happened." He considered this for a moment. Then he sat down on the low concrete barrier at the edge of the lot, and she sat beside him, and he talked. He told her about the phone call from the school nurse. He told her about standing at Vince Garrett's office door and explaining that his daughter might have a concussion and he needed to leave. He told her about the way Garrett had looked at him, not angry exactly, but certain, the way people look when they've already decided and are waiting for the conversation to catch up. He told her about coming back the next morning and finding the incident report on his desk. He told her about reading it twice and recognizing every word and understanding that the version of events in that document had been assembled by someone who knew exactly which words to use. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask her for anything. He recounted it the way a person recounts something they have already made their peace with. Not because they've forgiven it, but because holding on to the outrage takes energy they no longer have. Diana listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Around them, the lot was emptying, the last of the workers dispersing toward the street. "The file doesn't mention Sophie," she said finally. "Not once." "No," he said. It wouldn't. She looked at him. I want to fix this. Calvin turned his head and looked back at her, steady, unhurried, with the careful attention of a man who had learned that sincerity and consequences were not the same thing. Then fix the part that made it possible, he said, not just the part with my name on it. Diana held his gaze and said nothing, but something in her shifted, the clear, irreversible shift of a person who has just been handed the right question and knows they cannot put it down. She moved carefully at first. Diana returned to the office that afternoon and requested a formal internal review of the Brooks termination, routed through the compliance team rather than HR, a distinction that would signal, to anyone paying attention, that this was not a routine inquiry. Within 2 hours, she had 3 separate responses. A memo from Patricia Cole reiterating that the termination had followed protocol, a call from Hartwell's general counsel advising that reopening the case could expose the company to a pattern of practice claim if other terminated employees sought similar reviews, and a message from one of her senior directors asking, with careful neutrality, whether there was something he should be aware of. The machine had noticed, and the machine had opinions. She met with the general counsel the following morning, a precise man named Arthur Finley, who had been with the company for 12 years and who had the gift of making caution sound like wisdom. He laid out the risk clearly. If Diana intervened in a single termination case at the subsidiary level without a formal systemic basis, she would be setting a precedent. Every disciplinary action taken in the past several years could theoretically be challenged. The legal exposure was not hypothetical. I understand the impulse, Arthur said, folding his hands on the table. But the right answer here may be a quiet settlement, compensation, a reference letter, closure for everyone. Diana looked at him. And what does he get back? Arthur paused. I'm sorry? His reputation, she said. His record. The version of events that follows him to the next interview. What does a settlement give him back? Arthur did not have an answer for that. He had not understood that to be the question. While Diana was navigating the resistance above, Calvin was sinking below it. The temporary warehouse work paid enough to cover groceries and utilities, but not rent, not the full amount, not on the timeline his landlord was willing to extend. He had called twice about a grace period. The second call had not gone well. He sat at the kitchen table that night and did the math 3 different ways, and the math said the same thing each time. Sophie had asked him carefully one evening while setting the table for dinner, Dad, are we going to have to move? He told her no, in the steady voice he used when he needed her to believe something before he fully believed it himself. She nodded and went back to folding napkins, and he turned toward the stove so she wouldn't see his face. Then, on a Thursday, a colleague from Hartwell texted him a screenshot. Vince Garrett had been named to a newly created senior operations role, a promotion, effective the following Monday, announced in the company's internal newsletter with a photograph and a quote about operational excellence and team leadership. Calvin read it once, set his phone face down on the table, picked it up and read it again. He sat there for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and began to write. He wrote to 6 former colleagues still working in the Hartwell operations division, people who had been on that floor with him for years, who knew what the work actually looked like from the inside. He didn't ask for anything. He simply wrote out what had happened, in the same plain sequence it had occurred. The phone call, the request, the denial, the report, the file that left his daughter out entirely. He wrote without bitterness because bitterness would give someone a reason to dismiss it. He finished at 20 past midnight, read it back once, and sent it. He didn't know if it would reach anyone who mattered, but he knew that if he didn't write it, the only version of the story in existence would be the one Vince Garrett had written for him. And that, Calvin had decided, was the one thing he was not willing to accept. The email arrived on a Friday evening just before 8. It came through the general compliance inbox, forwarded by a Hartwell operations employee named Ray Tillman, who had worked alongside Calvin for 7 years. Ray had added only a single line above the forwarded message. You should know this exists. Below it was Calvin's letter. Diana read it at her desk, the office dark except for the lamp at her elbow and the city grid glowing through the floor-to-ceiling window behind her. She read it slowly, the way she read things when she needed to be sure she was not reading what she expected to find. Calvin's account was precise, unadorned. It did not reach for sympathy or indignation. It simply placed events in the order they had occurred and let them stand there. She was still sitting with it when a second message arrived, this one from a different address, an employee she didn't recognize by name, with an attachment and 3 words in the subject line. Please listen carefully. The attachment was an audio file, 41 seconds. She put in her earphones and pressed play. The recording was poor quality, a phone held at a distance, ambient warehouse noise underneath. The employee who sent it had included a short note. He had been in the adjacent break room the day after Calvin's termination when he heard the voices through the wall, had recorded it on instinct, and had kept it for weeks not knowing what to do with it. Calvin's letter had made the decision for him. The voices on the recording were clear enough, 2 of them. One was Vince Garrett, the other was Patricia Cole. The timestamp in the file metadata read the day after Calvin's termination. Vince's voice. I want this closed out clean. No appeal window, no open review period. File it, process it, done. Patricia. That's within our discretion if we classify it as a conduct violation. Vince. Then classify it. A pause. He went over my head in September, complained about the shift rotation to the regional director. I let it go. I'm not letting it go twice. Diana pulled out her earphones. She sat for a long time without moving. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business. Lights on in offices across the street, a siren somewhere moving north, the low rhythm of traffic on the avenue below. None of it registered. What registered was the 41 seconds she had just heard, and the sudden total clarity of understanding that what had been done to Calvin Brooks was not a failure of process. It was deliberate. He had raised a legitimate concern through a legitimate channel 3 months before his termination, and someone, a man who now had a new title and a photograph in the company newsletter, had waited for an opportunity and used it. Diana stood and walked to the window. She had built Mercer Group over 9 years with the conviction that good systems produced good outcomes, that if the structures were sound, the people inside them would behave soundly. What she was holding right now was evidence that the architecture had a room in it she had never looked inside. And in that room, a man who had done nothing wrong had been quietly demolished. She thought about Sophie standing at the bakery counter, holding her coins, asking for something sweet to bring home to her father. She thought about Calvin at his kitchen table at midnight, writing a letter he wasn't sure anyone would read. Not to win, but to keep the true version of events alive somewhere outside of Vince Garrett's documentation. Both of them, in their different ways, had refused to disappear quietly. Diana returned to her desk. She opened a new email and began to type. The subject line read, Emergency Leadership Review, Hartwell Operations, Monday, 8 a.m., Attendance Mandatory. She listed the names. Vince Garrett, Patricia Cole, Arthur Finley, 2 board members, the head of internal audit. She sent it before she could reconsider. Then she sat back and understood, fully, without softening it, that whatever happened on Monday, she would not be able to unknow what she knew tonight. Monday arrived the way difficult days do, ordinary on the surface, the coffee still hot, the elevator still slow, the city outside still doing what cities do. The conference room on the 14th floor filled at 8 o'clock exactly. Vince Garrett came in without making eye contact, sat at the far end of the table, and placed his hands flat in front of him in the manner of a man who has prepared himself for a difficult conversation by deciding in advance that he is in the right. Patricia Cole sat 2 seats away, a folder in front of her, her expression settled into careful neutrality. Arthur Finley arrived last, set his briefcase beside his chair, and looked at Diana with the quiet attention of a man waiting to see which direction the wind was running. Diana stood at the head of the table. She did not sit. She began with the file. She walked through it with precision, the incident report, the termination notice, the documented timeline. She did not editorialize. She let each piece speak in sequence. Then she placed a printed transcript of the audio recording on the table and let everyone read it. The room changed. Vince started to speak. Diana raised one hand. Not aggressively, just with the quiet certainty of someone who has not finished, and he stopped. She laid out what the recording established, that the termination of Calvin Brooks had not been a procedural response to a conduct violation. It had been a retaliatory action, executed with full awareness, against an employee who had raised a legitimate internal complaint. That the documentation had been constructed to make retaliation look like process, and that this had occurred inside a company she was responsible for. "I want to be clear," she said, looking around the table. "This is not a legal strategy session. This is not a conversation about precedent or exposure. What happened to this man was wrong. It was wrong on the day it happened, and it did not become less wrong because it was correctly formatted." Arthur Finley leaned forward. "Diana, there are real legal implications here that we have an obligation." "I know," she said. "We'll address them. But I will not address the legal implications of doing the right thing before I've decided to do the right thing." One of the board members, a man named Gerald Holt, who had been on the board since Diana's father's time, asked in his measured way what exactly Diana intended to do, and whether she had considered how this would look externally if it became known that an executive had acted against an employee for filing a complaint. Diana looked at him. "Gerald," she said, "if our concern right now is how it will look that one of our supervisors retaliated against a man for speaking up, I think we may have identified a larger problem than the one we came in here to discuss." The room was quiet. She looked at Vince Garrett then, directly, without hostility, but without any of the softening that would have allowed him to misread the moment. "You will not be taking that new role," she said. "Human Resources will begin a formal review of your conduct record this week. Until it concludes, you are on administrative leave." Vince opened his mouth. "That's not a discussion," Diana said. And then to the room. "I want a full account of what we're going to do to fix this on my desk by Wednesday. Not a settlement, a correction. There's a difference, and I expect everyone in this room to understand it before we speak again." She gathered her notes and walked out. She met with Calvin on Wednesday afternoon. Not in a conference room, not in any space that belonged to the company's official architecture of meetings and decisions. She had asked, through Ray Tillman, whether Calvin would be willing to meet at a neutral location, a small meeting room at a public library 4 blocks from his apartment. He had said yes. He arrived on time. He sat across from her at a plain wooden table with a cup of coffee he had brought himself, and he waited. Diana told him what had been found. She walked through it plainly, the recording, the retaliatory motive, the deliberate construction of the paper trail. She did not soften it or frame it as a system failure in the abstract. She told him that a specific person had decided to use a specific moment against him, and that the structures around that person had made it easy. Calvin listened without interrupting. He looked like a man receiving information he had already known to be true, and was now simply watching the rest of the world arrive at. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "If Sophie hadn't walked into that bakery, if none of this had found its way to you the way it did, would any of this have happened?" Diana had been expecting the question. She settled on the only answer she could give, honestly. "I don't know," she said, "and that's the part I have to live with and change." Calvin looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single small nod that did not mean forgiveness or absolution, but meant, "I believe you understand what you just said." She offered him full reinstatement at Hartwell, with back pay for the weeks since his termination, a corrected personnel file with the incident report formally withdrawn, and a written acknowledgement, internal and documented, that his departure had been the result of retaliatory conduct, not any violation on his part. She also offered him the option of transferring to a different division within Mercer Group, if returning to Hartwell felt untenable. Calvin said he would think about it. Not to delay, but in the straightforward way of a man who takes decisions seriously and does not perform certainty he doesn't have. Before they stood to leave, Diana told him one more thing. Beginning in the new year, Mercer Group Holdings would be implementing a revised emergency leave policy across all subsidiaries, one that explicitly protected employees who left their posts due to a dependent family member's medical emergency, and required documented supervisor acknowledgement before any absence could be classified as unauthorized. The training sessions being developed around the new policy would use a composite case study drawn from what had happened to him. Details anonymized, but the lesson intact. "The lesson is too important to file away," she said. Calvin stood and picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "My daughter," he said, "asked for leftover pastries because she thought it would make me feel better." He paused. "She wasn't wrong. She was just solving a smaller version of the right problem." Diana smiled. Not the managed, professional smile she had worn through most of the past 2 weeks, but the real one, the kind that surfaces when something lands exactly as true. "She's going to be extraordinary," Diana said. Calvin looked at her, and for the first time since she had met him, something behind his eyes moved quietly toward light. "I know," he said. "She gets that from her mother." 3 weeks later, Calvin went back to work. He chose Hartwell, not because it was the easiest choice, and not because everything that had happened there had been undone. It hadn't, not fully, and he knew it wouldn't be. He chose it because he had spent 11 years building something real in that building. Relationships, knowledge, a reputation among the people on the floor who knew the difference between a coordinator who showed up and one who simply clocked in. Walking away would have meant letting Vince Garrett's version of him be the last word. Cal had already decided on the night he wrote that letter that he was not going to allow that. His first morning back, he arrived at 7:32, not because he needed to, but because it was his habit, and his habits were his own. Ray Tillman was waiting by the coffee machine and handed him a cup without saying anything. That was enough. Sophie found out on a Thursday evening, when her father came home from his second day back and set his work bag down by the door. The old place, the right place, where it had always gone before. She was at the kitchen table doing homework. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. He was not the same as before exactly. There was something in him that had been handled roughly and would carry the mark of it. But the stillness that had settled over him in those weeks, the stillness of a man waiting for something that never came, was gone. He moved through the kitchen with purpose. He opened the refrigerator and asked her what she wanted for dinner in the voice that meant he was actually asking, not going through the motions of asking. She said, "Whatever you want to make." He made pasta. He hummed while the water boiled. Sophie watched him from her side of the table and thought about the bakery, the coins in her pocket, the woman at the window table who had looked up, the small white box tied with a piece of twine that she had carried home that evening and placed on the kitchen counter without explanation. Her father had opened it and eaten one of the shortbread cookies standing at the counter, still in his coat. She had thought at the time that the cookie had helped. She understood now that it had done something different from helping. It had opened a door that neither she nor her father had known was there, and someone on the other side of it had chosen to walk through. Diana did not tell anyone about the bakery. It was not a story she felt belonged in a boardroom or a press release or any of the official language of organizational change. It belonged to the 3 people who had been inside it, and it could stay there. What she did do on the first Friday of December was stop at the bakery after work the way she always had. Same table, same window, same low light over the pastry case. She ordered coffee. She sat with her notebook open and did not write anything in it for a long time. She thought about the question Calvin had asked her. Would any of this have happened? She still didn't know. That was the honest answer, and she had decided to hold it honestly, not as guilt, but as instruction. Because the question did not only reach backward, it reached forward too, into every decision she had not yet made, every file she had not yet read, every person in the lower floors of her company who was doing the work quietly and well, and trusting that the system around them was worth trusting. She owed them more than a better answer. She owed them the kind of leadership that did not require a child with coins in her pocket to make itself visible. Diana closed her notebook, finished her coffee, and walked back out into the cold. She had work to do. 3 people walked away from that bakery changed. A little girl learned that love isn't always enough, but it can be the thing that starts everything. A father learned that dignity, once it's yours, cannot be taken unless you stop defending it. And a leader learned that the most important room in any organization isn't the boardroom. It's the one she's never looked inside. Sometimes the smallest question, asked by the smallest voice, is the one that changes everything. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people, quiet courage, and the moments that matter, subscribe to the channel. We'll be here every week with another one.